Honored guests, the 2022 Fall Convocation of Case Western Reserve University is hereby convened. Please remain standing for the singing of the national anthem, which will be sung by Andrea Regley.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of Case Western Reserve University, Eric W. Kaler.
Thank you, Professor Bostock, and welcome faculty, staff, students, alumni, community members, and our friends to our fall convocation. Thank you for joining us to begin the 2022-23 academic year. And we all look forward to the learning, the research, the innovation, and the growth for our students and for ourselves that lies ahead. Just last week, I welcomed the undergraduate class of 2026 into our Spartan community. Some of you are in the audience today, and I hope that your first few days of classes have gone well. Let me tell you that the class of 2026 is an academically talented group of 1,550 students, and they are also the most diverse class of first-year students at Case Western Reserve ever. Nearly half of them identify as people of color, 25% identify as an underrepresented minority, and 24% identify as Asian American. They represent 70 countries, and they speak 57 languages. 13% of them are the first in their families to attend college. So again, welcome our class of 2026. We wish all of our undergraduate, graduate, and professional students a healthy, happy, and successful year. Now, during our convocation today, we will present this year's distinguished university professors, and also the award-winning author Peter Ho Davies will speak to you from the stage. Mr. Davies is the 2022 Elaine G. Haddon Distinguished Visiting Author. He's the author of 5 works of fiction, including this year's common reading selection, The Fortunes. Now, before we begin our formal program, I want to acknowledge the trustees and emeriti trustees who are with us today, and I also want to recognize the individuals behind me. In addition to our 2022 Distinguished University Professors, we're joined by our Provost, Ben Vincent III, our deans, our vice presidents and senior leaders, the chairs of the Staff Advisory Council and the Faculty Senate, and the presidents of our Undergraduate Student Government, Graduate Student Council, and Postdoctoral Research Association. And in the audience in their academic regalia are many esteemed members of our faculty. So I ask all of you, please stand so that we can recognize all that they do for our students, our university, and our community. Thank you all. Yeah, you too. Today, we're joined by Julie Gerberding, Vice Chair of the Case Western Reserve University Board of Trustees. She also chairs the Research and Tech Transfer Committee of the board. Dr. Gerberding earned her undergraduate and medical degrees from Case Western Reserve, and she is a world-renowned public health and biosecurity expert. From 2002 to 2009, she was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and today, she is the CEO of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. She's a member of the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the Infectious Disease Society of America and the American College of Physicians, and a member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation. She has served on our Board of Trustees since 2011, and we are immensely grateful for her leadership, her wise counsel, and her unwavering support of Case Western Reserve. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Julie Gerberding to the podium.
Thank you, President Kaler. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome everyone today to our fall convocation. This is a special honor for me on behalf of the entire Board of Trustees, and I love this tradition of really welcoming people to campus and bringing us all together at the beginning of the school year. This is not the first time I've been on the podium of Severance Hall because I did commence here twice, once as an undergraduate and once as a medical student, and also had the honor of delivering a commencement address here to the medical school many years ago. But I don't think I've ever been here in a more relaxed and a more welcoming mode. So thank you so much for joining us. You know, the Fall Convocation is really an opportunity to honor our newest distinguished university professors for their scholarship, their teaching, and of course their service to the entire university. But in addition to these very distinguished faculty members, I really want to acknowledge the entire faculty of Case Western Reserve. Clearly, the gift of my life was the opportunity to interact with this fine faculty, and they have shaped our campus, our student life, our communities, and well beyond that, in many ways, our entire world through their scholarship and their creative endeavors. So we honor them today for their contributions to the educational mission of Case Western Reserve, but also in the context of the pandemic for their perseverance, their agility, and really their courage in keeping the university alive and vital during that difficult period of time. And to our students, new and returning, just welcome. I encourage you to engage in all aspects of life on this campus. I can tell you that I had fine instruction here, but I don't remember too much of my calculus class. What I do remember is the incredible opportunity to immerse in the campus life, to usher here in Severance Hall, to experience the many cultural institutions, the Spartans at an athletic event, or whatever it is. I hope you make the very best of your experience here. Yes, we want you to graduate as successful, ambitious, creative, and productive citizens, but we also want you to have a warm and lively campus experience and really generate the support and the connectivity that is the very best we have to offer here. So, as we begin this semester and continue our recovery from all of the disruptions of the pandemic, please remember that there are a number of events planned for this coming year. Homecoming, Family Weekend are just around the corner. We're going to be bringing renowned authors and scholars to campus. We have the Think Forum, the William Skirball Writers Center stage, the Martin Luther King Convocation, just to name a few. So I hope you accept the invitation to join us for these opportunities of meaningful campus engagement. Finally, at Case Western Reserve, we're committed to think beyond the possible. So please keep that in mind as you begin what I hope will be an absolutely extraordinary academic year. Thank you and best wishes.
Thank you, Dr. Gerberding. It's now my pleasure to welcome the undergraduate student government president, Anya Hari. She is a neuroscience major from Sugar Land, Texas, and she's a passionate supporter of Case Western Reserve students and a tireless advocate for her peers. In addition to her role in student government, Ananya is a researcher in the Fox Lab. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
It is a privilege to be here talking to alumni, faculty, students, and administration. Those of us out there changing the world today, and those of us who are here to build skills and knowledge to do so in the future. A few days ago, at the University Welcome, I talked to first-year students about the importance of pushing your boundaries. Today, looking at the audience that spans several decades, what comes to mind is how rapidly the world is changing before our eyes. In the last 2 years, we have seen changes in the way we work, run our governments, organize our businesses, communities, services, education, and life itself. We've also made significant strides in how we think, deploy our resources, merge time boundaries, boundaries that were once clearly demarcated as personal and professional. The one thing I know for sure, apart from our education at Case Western Reserve, is that we need to take this time to develop our soft skills. We must learn to be agile and flexible so that we can leverage the world of today, which is just one gigantic network of people, intelligent processes, and systems. But at the same time, we need to learn to maintain that edge that comes with human ingenuity. The Case Western Reserve alumni who are here today are already working, and that are working in the real world already know this. They've experienced the boundaryless working environment where professionals collaborate from all corners of the world. They know that choosing to be lifelong learners makes keeping up with the rapid pace of the change and discovery in the world just a little bit easier. Students like me, who are going to spend the next years of our life gaining knowledge in our chosen areas, I want to build the bridge, the learning from across Case Western Reserve generations. I want to leverage the talent, innovation, flexibility that we have here today with the experience and knowledge of those that have come before us and those that will follow. Collectively, we will be stronger as we innovate, push together, navigate change, and work positively to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. Thank you very much. Now it's my privilege to introduce this year's class of distinguished university professors. These faculty members are internationally renowned in their fields, and they are deeply engaged in the life of the university. They advance their fields through discovery, scholarly work, and service to national and international organizations in their areas of expertise. And they also advance Case Western Reserve through their teaching, mentoring, collaboration, research, and service. As you might imagine, the title of Distinguished University Professor is the single highest honor the university can bestow on a member of our faculty. In your program, you will find detailed biographies of each of today's honorees, and I encourage you to read about their remarkable achievements. So, the new class of Distinguished University Professors, when I call your name, please step forward. I'll share a bit about you, and Provost Ben Vinson will place the medal around your neck. Dr. Pamela Davis is the Arlene H. and Curtis F. Garvin Research Professor at the School of Medicine and former Dean of the School of Medicine. Her career at Case Western Reserve spans an impressive 40 years. During her tenure as Dean of the School of Medicine, the school was ranked 11th in the nation for producing successful academic researchers and 20th in NIH Institutes of Health funding. She also played a leading role in the school's most prominent collaborative achievement in education, the beautiful health education campus. And in addition to her extraordinary leadership, Dr. Davis is a renowned researcher of cystic fibrosis and successfully has developed novel therapies, including bringing them to clinical trials. Dr. Davis holds 7 U.S. patents and has published more than 160 articles. She's been elected to the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Inventors, and as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Davis, for your leadership and service as a scientist and educator and mentor, and for your many valuable contributions to cystic fibrosis research, and for your dedication to Case Western Reserve, it is my great honor to confer upon you the title of Distinguished University Professor. Congratulations. Jonathan Karn is a professor and chair of the Department of Molecular Biology and Microbiology at the School of Medicine. He is also the director of the Center for AIDS Research. An internationally recognized molecular virologist, Professor Karn has focused his career on eradicating or finding a functional cure for HIV. In the early fight against AIDS, his groundbreaking discovery about HIV's two transcriptional regulatory proteins helped explain why HIV can't be cured with antiretroviral drugs. Since Professor Karn joined the university in 2002, he's focused on translational research, taking advantage of the opportunity to advance HIV research to patients. In April of 2022, he co-founded the Cleveland SARS-CoV-2 Task Force, a group that has obtained over $10 million in funding to examine multiple aspects of the virus. Professor Karn has written more than 90 primary research papers and 42 reviews, and he holds 10 patents. Over the course of his career, he has mentored more than 60 postdoctoral fellows, students, and scientists. So, Professor Karn, for your commitment to students as an educator and a mentor, for your contributions to HIV research, and for your support of Case Western Reserve University, it is my great honor to bestow upon you the title of Distinguished University Professor. Congratulations. And finally, for this year, Roger Quinn is the Arthur P. Armington Professor of Engineering at the Case School of Engineering. Professor Quinn joined Case Western Reserve in 1986, and his initial research focused on control of space structures. But his research focus shifted after he was asked by his colleagues to build an insect-like robot for an innovative project. That project led him to becoming a pioneer in the new field of biorobotics. And since 1990, he has directed the Center for Biologically Inspired Robotics, and he's graduated approximately 100 graduate students into the field. Today, he leads a large international next-generation neuroscience team to better understand communication, coordination, and control in animal neuromechanical systems. His team is also part of a team developing soft robotic graspers, both with funding from the National Science Foundation. Professor Quinn has been published a total of 524 times, served in many leadership roles, and has mentored and taught many students in a variety of classes, some of which he developed. So, Professor Quinn, for your contributions to students as an educator and a mentor, for your many contributions to the field of biorobotics, and for your dedication to Case Western Reserve University, it is my great honor to confer upon you the title of Distinguished University Professor. Congratulations. Congratulations again to the newest class of Distinguished University Professors. And now we'll move to the portion of our program focused on our common reading selection. But first, I want to acknowledge and thank the late Elaine Laney Hayden, a beloved member of our community who endowed this annual lecture starting in 2012. And we are particularly and profoundly grateful for her years of extraordinary engagement with our university. More than 40 years ago, she became the first woman to chair what was then known as the Board of Overseers, and she served as a university trustee for 27 years. And we're honored that her daughter, Allie, could join us today. Thank you for being here. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Ho Davies, the 2022 Elaine J. Haddon Distinguished Visiting Author. Mr. Davies is the author of 5 works in fiction, including our common reading selection for this year, The Fortunes. The Fortunes won the 2017 Innisfield Wolf Award and the Chautauqua Prize and was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Mr. Davies has also published 2 short story collections. His stories and essays have appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, the Paris Review, The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others, and they have also been widely anthologized. And in 2003, Granta magazine named him among its best young British novelists. Mr. Davies is also a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and he is a winner of the PEN/Mahmood and PEN/Macmillan Awards. Born in Britain to Welsh and Chinese parents, he now makes his home in the United States. He's taught at the University of Oregon, Northwestern, and Emory Universities, and he's currently on the faculty at the University of Michigan, where he's the Charles Baxter Distinguished Collegiate Professor. And today we are absolutely delighted to welcome him to Case Western Reserve. Mr. Davies.
Thank you, President Keller, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all, to your colleagues, yourself, to everybody here for the incredibly warm welcome I've enjoyed here at Case today. It's clearly a fantastic, nurturing, cherishing community, and to the freshmen entering it, I want to say congratulations to you all. I should say special thanks to Daniel Goldmark and to the Common Reading Committee for selecting the book, to Edwin Mays of the First Year Experience Group, Peter Whiting and Lisa Nielsen of the SAGES program for particularly helping facilitate this visit. And of course, congratulations very much to the new Distinguished University Professors, and again, especially to that entering class of 2026. You guys, as for reasons that will become clear as I talk, are much on my mind at the moment. So these remarks are directed for you largely, I think. I should say, by way of starting informally, I always appreciate in an introduction when people mention that I'm originally from Britain, because it relieves people in the audience from wondering, where is that accent from? Which I know can be a distraction along the way. I gave a reading, I think, many years ago, and I think whoever talked to me afterwards had maybe come in a few minutes late. It didn't catch where I was from. Maybe it wasn't mentioned in the introduction. And they asked me afterwards where I was from. I said I was from Britain, and they said, oh, I noticed you had an accent, but I thought it might just be an affectation. So I'd like to clear that up. It's also true that if in the course of these comments my pronunciation should seem at all strange, not to worry, it's just that it's correct. These are very old jokes. I appreciate your laughter. I had to make sure that I could get a laugh in this getup, so I'm grateful for that. It is, of course, a very great honor to be here as your Elaine G. Haydon visiting author, and to have my novel, The Fortunes, chosen as this year's common reading, though I have to confess that on that score, I have just a mild touch of trepidation. After 25 years of college teaching, I'm well aware that assigning a novel inevitably and instantly makes it about 20% less appealing than any book you might have discovered for yourself, that you might have chosen for yourself. Some of you may know this already. Most of you will have intuited it from high school. It's a pretty common unconscious bias, and by the standards of such things, a relatively benign one I remain prone to myself whenever I hear about the latest must-read, critically acclaimed novel. Still, like all unconscious biases, we can hope that by making it conscious, we might resist it, and I confess to a little special pleading on behalf of my own book here. That bias surely has something to do with the anticipatory dread, again rooted in high school, of being tested on what we've read. The idea that there might be a right answer about literature, the fear that we might not get it. The kind of anxieties that turn reading a novel from a pleasure into a kind of obligation, a chore. More subtly, I suspect this resistance to assigned text also has something to do with the way they risk short-circuiting one of the deepest pleasures of reading. Think about the books or the writers that you love, the connection you feel to them. You might have chosen those books, but you have likely also felt chosen by them. There's an intimacy to reading such works. We somehow feel those books or authors, never mind how popular, magically speak to us personally, individually even. And like other forms of intimacy that you may be acquainted with, that implies and even requires that they don't connect with others in quite the same way. Any book loved by someone, by that token, is likely ignored or overlooked, even hated by someone else. Indeed, one reason we love it may well be that others don't. It means we're included in some charmed circle while others are excluded. It's why you probably love very different books than your parents or your siblings or any of your professors, though it's also one of the great thrills of friendship, something that can be especially true in college, when you meet someone who also loves a book that you love and the charmed circle widens a little. If I have one hope for all you freshmen, it's that you continue to make time in your busy college lives to still read unassigned books for pleasure. The books we love, after all, that we feel an intense connection to, tell us something about who we are, become part of who we are, become entwined in our identities, which is what I want to talk about a little this afternoon. For me, by the way, when I was about the age many of you are now, one of those writers was Kurt Vonnegut Jr., His humor spoke to me, his humanism, his roots in science fiction, but also the sense of him straddling the arts and sciences. He started out as a technical writer at GE. My first degree is in physics. And one small personal pleasure of preparing for this talk was watching a video of him on this very stage back in 2004. Now, I say all this in the knowledge that supply chain issues have meant that many of you didn't get copies of The Fortunes until you arrived on campus last week, and understandably, probably haven't had the chance to read it yet, between the meeting and greeting, orientation and registration, not to mention the runs to Target. That's disappointing in one sense, but just maybe a blessing in disguise. It gives me a chance to assure you in advance that there are no right answers about the book. The role of fiction, after all, to paraphrase Chekhov, is to ask questions, not to answer them. A good novel makes us think or feel without necessarily telling us how to think or feel. I know you won't all connect with the book, and that's okay. There's value, as I've noted, even in the books we resist or reject, but not least because they clarify what we love in other books. But of course, I hope some of you will, and moreover that you'll do so on your own terms. Here's the weird thing, though. Many of you who haven't even started the book yet may nonetheless have already read an extract. And some of you who have started it may have already had a sense of déjà vu reading it, as if you've encountered some of it before. But where? Well, if you cast your minds back some 18 months, some of you might recall that a passage from the book about the Chinese-American actress Anna May Wong, Hollywood's first Asian star back in the 1930s, featured in the reading portion of the SAT exam you may have taken in the spring of 2021. The same SAT, the scores of which you may even have submitted as part of your application here to Case Western, though I appreciate that applications here are test optional. Suddenly, all that talk about getting tested on what we've read about right answers isn't so theoretical. But how do I know all this? Not from the College Board or my publishers. I should stress I didn't get paid for the extract. I should hasten to add I didn't make any money from the trauma of your SATs. Short quotations from a text for educational purposes fall under the fair use copyright exception. So I didn't know the passage would be on the test in advance, and I only know now because my son, Owen, who like you is a college freshman this year out in California, took that same SAT as you and opened it to find the first question about his dad's book. Fiction writers have a technical expression for this kind of thing. You can't make this shit up. And just in case you're wondering if this gave my son an unfair advantage, I should note he hadn't, and still hasn't, read the book. So many of you are in excellent company, and this even though it is dedicated to him. For the record, he scored 8 out of 10 on that portion of the test. Now, I should say I'm fine with him not having read it yet. The very worst reading assignment, after all, may be the book your dad wrote. But of course, I hope he will one day. This isn't even the first book I've dedicated to him. That would be my earlier novel, The Welsh Girl, which came out when he was 3, when he had a pretty good excuse for not reading it, though he did enjoy finding his name in the front matter. Even The Fortunes, which came out when he was 12, somewhere between finishing Percy Jackson and starting the Hunger Games, wasn't meant for him then. But every writer, in some sense, writes towards a future reader or readers. Writing in that sense is an act of hope that there will be somebody who'll want to read whatever we're composing. An act of arrogance too, though let's focus on the hope for now. Books in that sense, all books, not just historical novels or science fiction, are little time machines, messages from the past of their writing to the future of your reading. Even more broadly, all stories are time machines, filled with flashback and backstory, deadlines and countdowns, relying fundamentally on sequences of events, chains of causality, whose very medium is time. And this temporal consciousness, this sense of writing for the future, is probably also why writers, though we're embarrassed to admit it, let's keep this between ourselves, please, often have an eye on posterity, on lastingness. We hope our work may outlast, indeed outlive us, remain relevant into the future. So while I write something called literary fiction, secretly, I, and I dare say other writers like me, harbor the hope that one day, down the line, when we're dead and gone, someone will peel off that label and find beneath it the magic word literature. That's a pretension, of course, albeit a common one. Even popular commercial writers know very well that Shakespeare or Dickens were the Stephen Kings of their day. But it's also an ambition, an aspiration, the very thing that I hope you also packed for college. My own hopes for posterity have actually become a little bit more modest since I became a father. A child is a form of biological posterity, after all. So when I think of a future reader now, that mythical ideal reader that writers are sometimes asked about, it's my son. And it has been since before he could read. That's why the book is dedicated to him, why it's for him. All of my books are, whether they have his name on the dedication page or not. Appropriately enough, given all this talk of past and future, the book is in large part a historical novel, a kind of time capsule, if you will. It offers, albeit in fragmentary form, a fictionalized overview of Chinese American history, some of its key moments and real figures, stretching from the earliest arrivals of Chinese immigrants during the California Gold Rush to the near present. In between, there's that section about Anna May Wong, set in the 1930s, and another section set in the 1980s about the notorious and tragic hate crime murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American mistaken for Japanese and beaten to death by a couple of auto workers in Detroit at the height of economic anxiety about Japanese car imports, a case that galvanized and united an Asian-American political consciousness. The book is framed by two notable and contrasting phases of Chinese immigration. A largely male influx of labor into the gold fields, and shortly thereafter to build the Transcontinental Railroad, what's sometimes referred to as a bachelor society. And much nearer our own time, another gendered immigration of mostly female babies adopted from China, a section of the book inspired by the other person the book is dedicated to, my goddaughter Olan. She was one of those babies. That section, I should say, is not directly based on her or her mother's experience of adoption. Her mother, by the way, was my roommate in grad school, though their examples did offer one other inspiring historical contrast. I knew from my research of attention and antagonism back in the 1860s and 70s between those early Chinese immigrants and another group of recent arrivals, the Irish. Chinese labor built the Central Pacific portion of the Transcontinental Railroad over the Sierra Nevadas and into Utah, while Irish immigrant labor substantially contributed to the building of the Union Pacific line that came in from the east. These two groups were pitted against each other during the construction. Their respective companies' profits were determined by how much and how fast they could lay track. The undertaking was actually labeled the Great Race. And after the rails were joined by the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, that competition turned sour as both sets of workers competed, often violently, for jobs in the West. This is one of the roots of the so-called driving out of the Chinese, which culminated in the notorious Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, still the only US legislation to ever prevent a specific racial group immigrating to this country. And yet, all these years later, in a tiny, poignant bend in that long arc of history, my Chinese goddaughter's adoptive mother, my former roommate, she's an Irish immigrant. This brief summary suggests the book's somewhat unusual structure, a novel made up of 4 semi-discrete episodes. And I confess that structure is partly the result of the struggle to write the book. Initially, the whole thing was supposed to be about the building of the Transcontinental. Indeed, the very first germ of the idea goes back more than 25 years to the mid-90s when, as a new arrival myself in the US, I took a train from Boston to San Francisco, an eye-opening trip in general. The sheer continental scale of the US was a revelation to somebody from the UK, and specifically, it was when I first learned of the Chinese who helped build the earliest tracks. In it, that early vision of the book, as entirely set in the 1860s, complete with outlaws and train robberies, it would have been great, refused to come together. Its protagonist was, and remains, a fellow called Ah Ling, a real, if only footnoted, historical figure, a manservant to the railroad baron Charles Crocker, whose strength is reputed to have inspired his boss to hire Chinese workers to build it, in contravention to the prevailing stereotype of the day that the Chinese were too frail for such hard labor. Ling is that gift to a historical novelist, a real and pivotal figure who almost nothing is known about, an invitation for fiction to fill in the contours of history. I found myself fascinated by what it must have felt like to be him, to single-handedly upend a negative stereotype, surely a source of some pride and satisfaction, only to simultaneously be responsible for the hiring of thousands of his countrymen into dangerous, backbreaking, and exploitively underpaid work. That dilemma ultimately leads him to a decision to leave the spotlight, to vanish into history, to no longer represent, essentially. And good for him, though it left me a little in the lurch when my protagonist decided that he no longer wanted to be a protagonist after only about 100 pages of the novel I was supposed and had been paid to write. Cue panic, and a year or so of trying desperately to force my character back onto the stage until that burden of representation that he shrinks from reminded me of another figure, Anna May Wong, whose life and career in Hollywood had been both made and blighted by representation. The roles and stereotypes she performed and those she was not allowed to play. Anna May leads in turn to Vincent Chin, another tragic representative of race, and leads finally to me, or a loose approximation of me, my evil or possibly my feeble twin. The protagonist of the book's final section is, like me, a Chinese-American writer and teacher, not because what befalls him and his wife in China is based on my life or my wife's, but because I realized all those preceding figures, Ling, Anna, Vincent, were grappling with the same anxieties of representation that I felt as a writer. Who was I, half Chinese, half British, to write this? How could I or any one person hope to represent or speak for others? Like a lot of books, then, this one is in part about the very struggle to write it. And yet that fragmentary structure that I stumbled into is also, I hope, appropriate in another sense. I've been talking a lot about my son, my goddaughter, but that theme of parents and children, of family, of posterity, is also central to a book that is itself very much interested in questions of parents and children. Parents who lose children, like Vincent's mother, Lily Chin, who campaigned for his case to be reopened after the men who killed him were only fined $5,000. Parents who can't have children, Anna May, for instance, yearned to be a mother. And children separated from parents or who don't know their own parentage. Ling is, in my construction, mixed race, his mother a prostitute. The Chinese-American experience, since the days of that early bachelor society, the subsequent legal restrictions on women and families joining those men, on through the period of anti-miscegenation laws, Anna May Wong had many lovers, but maybe partly because she wasn't legally allowed to marry a white man, let alone kiss one on screen. That Chinese-American historical experience is one in which the typical family bonds of parents and children simply couldn't be taken for granted. This is for a story of a different immigrant group, Irish, Italian, the book might take the more familiar form of a multi-generational narrative, grandparents begetting children. But while there are Chinese-American families that can trace such long heritages, the sense of a broken lineage of generational interruption seemed truer to the larger history. Anna May is not related to Ah Ling, or to Vincent Chin, or to me, and yet we share an affinity, a kinship, a history, a community. And that's why the book is for my son and goddaughter, and just maybe for you. If your experience this past week or so is anything like my son's or mine's when I dropped him off at college and met his roommates and their parents, you've heard one question many times over. Where are you from? It's innocuous, friendly, well-meant, a good icebreaker. It gives us a first handle on someone else. Oh, she's from Oregon, he's from Georgia, they're from Michigan, even if it's an imperfect handle. I've lived and worked in all of those places. I might at one point or another in my life have said I was from any of those places. But that might have prompted a follow-up, of course. A little less innocuous, a little less well-meaning. Yes, but where are you from originally? Asian Americans, other hyphenated Americans, many non-white Americans have heard that one before. Nowadays, some might even call it a microaggression, though I'm more inclined to see it as another of those unconscious biases that, once recognized and made conscious, we can change. And the book is a kind of answer to that question, an answer for my son, on behalf of my goddaughter, written when they were perhaps too young to form it for themselves. Because where we're from, where we're all from, isn't just a place. It's a time. It's the past. And that past is shared, collective. The Chinese and Irish who built the Transcontinental Railroad were building a nation that neither were yet citizens of. This nation, our nation. The railroad, an incredible engineering and technological feat in its day, comparable to the invention of the telephone, the internet, united the country in physical, literal ways, but also in others, spiritual, political. It was authorized by Lincoln, but of course he didn't live to see it, though his body was carried in state by rail to his final resting place, with crowds coming out alongside the tracks to pay their respects. Indeed, after a civil war that almost tore the country apart, those railroad tracks were one way of stitching us back together. And immigrants built that. Chinese-American history, in that sense, any immigrant history, is part of American history. It's part of global history. Anna May Wong lives to see the end of the Chinese Exclusion Act, partly because China was a U.S. ally in World War II. Lily Chin's fight for justice for her son Vincent builds on and extends the hard-fought gains of the civil rights movement to a new group, Asian Americans. It's tempting, of course, to end here on this note of unity, commonality, and yet for all that I've spoken of the hope with which we write from the past into the future, a little like the hope with which we send children into the future. That future, this present, isn't always as hopeful as we'd wish. For all that the fortunes may say something about the past we've come from, and for all that any historical novelist hopes their work will resonate with the present, I can't claim to have foreseen the future. The book came out in the fall of 2016, September of that year to be precise, and a few months before that, I can recall debating the epigraph to one of the sections with my editor. It was a quote from then-candidate Trump used at the start of the Vincent Chin section, a quote in which he used the same pejorative about the Chinese that sparked the confrontation that led to Vincent's death, the idea being to suggest how the past echoes into the present. And yet, the line isn't in the book now. We cut it. As my editor argued, what seemed very timely in the summer of 2016 might seem swiftly dated after the 2016 election. Sometimes it seems hope blinds us to the future. Similarly, I couldn't imagine when writing about the couple who adopt from China at the end of the book, a couple who, like my wife and I, it's one of the very few autobiographical details in the book, had terminated an earlier pregnancy because of a catastrophic genetic test that within 6 years, Roe versus Wade would be overturned. A novel, as noted, is written from past to future, but that writing itself takes time. This book took me 7 or 8 years to write, so long that a joke I used to tell about it, that it took longer to write than it took to build the Transcontinental Railroad, though in my defense there were more Chinese working on the railroad, That joke actually made it into the last section of the book. As Jonathan Franzen, a novelist who has taken up to a decade on some of his novels, has lamented, if it takes you that long to write a book, how can you be sure that the issues you want to address in it will be relevant by the time you finish it? How to design a craft that can float on history for as long as it takes to build it, as he puts it, let alone for as long as it might be read. And yet here we are, 6 years later after the book came out, and it seems queasily prescient. I couldn't foresee the pandemic, of course, but the rise in anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiment that followed it, fueled by loose talk of the China virus and Kung flu, makes it seem as if our shameful past is becoming our shameless present. For the record, as an English professor, I'd like to point out to anyone who uses the latter phrase that it's actually spelled Kung F-U. Those anti-Asian sentiments, of course, preceded the pandemic. That Trump quote I mentioned is from a speech he gave in 2012 when he was only flirting with a presidential run. And the book, of course, charts a century-long history of anti-Asian discrimination. But the pandemic and the politics of blame around it turbocharged the hate. Since 2020, more than 11,000 hate incidents against Asians have been recorded, and those are just the reported numbers, representing a more than 300% rise in such incidents. They include outrages like the shooting rampage at 3 Atlanta spas in March 2021 and the widespread abuse of elderly Asians. 80% of all reported incidents were against Asians 60 and older, and a quarter of those were physical assaults. I thought, when I wrote about Vincent Chin, the 40th anniversary of whose death was marked this year, that I was writing historical fiction, not science fiction, not prophecy. In this darker sense, we're not only from the past, we're going back to it. As Kurt Vonnegut, a better prognosticator than me, said on this very stage in 2004, we live in a country where truth and reason and the lessons of history do not apply. This, then, isn't the future I hoped to write into, nor the future I hoped for my son or goddaughter or any of you. The dreadful cautionary irony here, be careful what you wish for, is that the book is more relevant today than when it was published 6 years ago. It's why I stand here before you today, and I find myself fervently wishing it weren't. Don't worry, I'm not going to end on that note. Writing is, as I've noted, an essentially hopeful act, and reading is too, by the way. Both of them efforts to connect with another, a stranger. So let us reach for some hope together. The Fortunes, for all that it's about Chinese American history, about immigration and race, is also more broadly and fundamentally about identity. Where are you from really means, who are you? A question we ask each other, but also ourselves, even if we're from right here. In the context of the book, and the context of my life, one of the struggles of hyphenated identity, true for Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, but also many other hyphenated Americans, is the tension, the competing claims of loyalty towards, on the one hand, our ethnic familial heritage, and on the other, to the larger culture we're also a part of. But it can feel as if to lean one way is to betray the other. To assimilate can feel like a turning from tradition, and yet a loyalty to our roots, our community, feels as if it can somehow imply a failure to engage with our broader society. I've struggled with that feeling of falling between, being neither one thing nor the other, being less than the sum of my parts, being from nowhere, in a sense. But the journey of the book, for me as its writer at least, is to clarify that apparent binary, Asian or American, and to reject it, to refute the either-or choice, and to answer both. In that sense, the book is about the hyphen, about the join, about how a hyphenated identity is not less than the identities on either side of it, but an identity of its own, in its own right. And something that heartens me enormously is that other hyphenated people, not necessarily Asian or American, often recognize something of themselves in the novel. And by the way, the book's odd four-part structure, is it a novel? Is it a collection of stories? Is it even fact or fiction? Well, the answer to those questions is also both. In that sense, the book's form, its identity, reflects that of its subjects. And finally, this question of competing identities and the need to reconcile them is something we all feel. It's not unique to immigrants or people of mixed race or mixed ethnicity. We all struggle with questions of authenticity. Which is the real me? And you freshmen might feel yourselves right now at one of those inflection points. Think back to the moment you said goodbye to your parents, maybe in your new dorm room. That's emotional, right? But also somehow weird. And part of the weirdness lies in the sense that your parents are saying goodbye to a child while you are growing into adulthood. We're all time travelers in the end. It manifests as that little guilty shiver of embarrassment over tearful goodbyes with your parents. You don't want to be seen as a child in this place where you will make your way as an adult. But the good news is that you're already practiced at what we might call code switching. Even at home, the person you are with your parents isn't the person you are with your friends or a significant other. That awkwardness when your parents meet your first boyfriend or girlfriend, that's what I'm talking about. That's you trying to negotiate two separate identities simultaneously. The burden of this, the struggle, the gnawing anxiety, is that we wonder which of these selves is the true one, the real one. Is my authentic self the one who visits with my 88-year-old mother in England, who's known me longer than anyone else? Or is it the one who engages with my son, who I've known for his whole life? Or is it the person I am with my wife, the person I'm most intimate with? Any of these people would have a claim to knowing the real me, an expectation that the me they're with is authentic, and yet the self I am with each of them is different in some sense. Does that make any of them false? I don't think so. I think I am all those selves, that they're all me, along with the me who writes and the me who talks about writing, and the me who even teaches writing, who are all also subtly distinct. And what's more, I think that you're the same. We contain multitudes. That's the human condition. That's the endless novelistic subject. And here's the thing. If you can take that on board about yourself, if you recognize what I'm describing, you might feel a little less prone to these anxieties of authenticity. But also, if you can understand that what is true of you is true of everyone else, that we're all these multiple, nuanced selves, that none of us can be reduced to one or two traits, well, then the pernicious limitations of stereotype, that mask we force onto others, might just be ameliorated. And that's a future. You're that future in which we might all find a little hope. Thank you. And I should say to the freshmen, read the book, don't read the book, love the book, hate the book, but call your parents, please.
Thank you so much for helping us to think about authenticity with both hope and humor as we look to the future. Now please welcome back Andrea Regley, who will lead us in singing the Alma Mater.
Shine on forever, Case Western Reserve, loyal and true are we. Your
Honored guests, this concludes our fall convocation. I would like to thank our Lane G. Haddon Distinguished Visiting Author, Peter Ho Davies, and invite all of you to a book signing on the second floor of the Tinkerville University Center, just east of Severance Hall. Please remain standing and at your seats until the academic procession exits the hall, and you can follow us over to Tinkerville.